I'm Rantasmo, and the Picture of Dorian Gray needs more gay. Oscar Wilde. Expert wordsmith, ingenious wit, noted sodomite, archetypal pimp fashion icon, and author of one of the most iconic Gothic novels in history. Wilde's infamous penchant for pederasty makes him something of a problematic fave by today's standards, but he nonetheless had a very strong influence on modern gay culture as we know it. Mostly the parts of it that involve being clever and catty and having really good hair. Wilde's only published novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, is only about as queer as one could openly be in the late 19th century, even after being thoroughly de-gayed by the editors of the magazine it was originally published in. And even so, it raised a moderate scandal among English critics. The homoeroticism was toned down even further for the book version released in 1891, but it still ended up being used as evidence against Wilde in his trial for sodomy a few years later. Here's a condensed version of the story. An artist named Basil Hallward completes his portrait of a young hottie named Dorian Gray. Basil's cynical friend, Lord Henry Wotton, warns Dorian that he won't stay young and beautiful forever, so he should indulge himself and enjoy his youth while he can. Dorian, not being especially genre-savvy, remarks that he would gladly give away his soul if the painting would grow old in his place, allowing him to stay young forever. Over time, Dorian falls prey to Lord Henry's hedonistic influence, and after cruelly breaking up with his fiancée, which leads her to commit suicide, the painting gains a cruel expression, and Dorian realizes that his wish has come true. Not only does the painting age instead of him, it also bears the physical evidence of his own sinful behavior. Incidentally, a lot of people during the Victorian era believed that being evil made you physically ugly. I guess the Victorian era ran on the same engine as Fable 2. Dorian proceeds to live a life of excess and indulgence, without any regard for the well-being of others. When Basil inquires about the rumors surrounding his sinful lifestyle, Dorian shows him the painting, which by this point is truly hideous. Basil is horrified, and in a fit of hatred, Dorian stabs him to death. Eventually, Dorian starts to regret his actions and resolves to be good and pure for the rest of his life. But when he looks at the painting to see if it's changed, he finds that it has a look of vain hypocrisy. Realizing that the painting is the only evidence of his evil deeds and needs to be destroyed, Dorian stabs it with the same knife he used to kill Basil. And when his servants enter the room, they find an ugly old man stabbed to death and a portrait of a young, beautiful Dorian Gray. This story has been adapted many times. My personal favorite might be this cheesy, made-for-TV, gender-swapped version set in the early 80s, where instead of a painting, it's a screen test, and Dorian gets her own theme song.
To hide the terror and the pain of Dorian.
Some of the more modern cinematic versions have a tendency to make Dorian more of an outright supervillain, and give him, like, Wolverine healing factor on top of his non-aging, but a couple of them also make the queer undertones of the story more explicit. In the 2009 film adaptation, Dorian has a bit of a decadent pansexual thing going on, and he even has a brief fling with Basil. The Showtime series Penny Dreadful transplants Dorian into a world populated with other icons of classic literary horror. His many sexual partners include the Bride of Frankenstein, as well as a transgender woman and a male werewolf played by Josh Hartnett. By the way, can we talk for a second about how Josh Hartnett plays a bisexual werewolf and nobody told me? I don't care that it's a spoiler, that shit should have been trending on Twitter immediately. The term homosexual had not yet made its way into the common English lexicon at the time that the original book was written, so none of the characters are really identified as such, and yet the story has a very strong homoerotic current running through it. It's most obvious in the character of Basil, the sensitive artist, whose infatuation with Dorian is implied to be rooted in sexual attraction. That's made even more explicit in the uncensored version released a few years ago. It includes some of those passages that Wilde's editors removed. Basil definitely comes across as a confirmed bachelor, and yet he is the story's moral center, urging Dorian towards a life of purity and goodness. Lord Henry's character doesn't necessarily read as queer, but there is a seduction of sorts as Henry draws Dorian into his world of sensualism and depravity. Basil and Henry are both initially drawn to Dorian because of his physical appearance, and they each try to pull Dorian into the direction of their own philosophy. So the relationship between the three of them does come across as a bit of a love triangle. As for Dorian himself, the details of his sinful activities are left largely ambiguous, but there are some intimations that his male friends tend to end up with soiled reputations. Take that as you will. Going beyond just the implied proclivities of the characters themselves, Dorian's story contains a lot of themes that LGBT people can relate to. Obviously, the obsession with youth and beauty kind of ties into the ageism and body image issues that are especially rampant in gay male communities. But Dorian isn't just obsessed with his own physical appearance, he's obsessed with the way that others see him. In the context of this story, his physical appearance reflects upon his moral reputation. When his friends hear rumors of all the evil things that Dorian has done, they're hesitant to believe them because Dorian doesn't look like the sort of person who would do those things. Again, it's kind of like the alignment system from Fable. He can't be evil, he doesn't have horns. And that's probably a direct commentary on society's preoccupation with the superficial. Meanwhile, Dorian is so terrified of people seeing his true self that he locks it away from the rest of the world. In fact, you could argue that the painting doesn't actually display the true nature of Dorian's inner soul, but rather his inner shame and guilt. He tries to hide it away, to destroy it, but he only ends up destroying himself. Not saying that being gay is on the same level as, murder, but hiding who you really are out of shame and putting up an appearance for the rest of society is certainly something that strikes a nerve with me personally. And I think it's a feeling that Oscar Wilde was probably familiar with too. Dorian ends up becoming a monster, but I think that Wilde really wanted to highlight the role that society played in creating that monster. So the next time you find yourself in a gothic morality tale, or an episode of The Twilight Zone, or a Goosebumps book, remember to be careful what you wish for. And maybe cool it with the stabbing. Just a suggestion.